Good evening, ma'am. I am B. Sai Chand and my roll number is 21951A1269 and I am from ITB section. So today's my topic is recursion and types of recursion. So let's start with what is recursion. The process in which a function calls itself directly or indirectly is called recursion and the corresponding function is called as recursive function. So using a recursion algorithm, certain problems can be solved quite easily. So example of such problems are Tower of Hanoi, TOH, and in order, pre-order, post-order tree, transversals, DFS of graph, etc. So a recursive function solves a particular problem by calling a copy of itself and solving smaller subproblems of the original problems. Many more recursive calls can be generated as and when required. It is essential to know that we would provide a certain case in order to terminate this recursive process. So we can say that every time the function calls itself with a simpler version of the original problem. So, types of recursion. Recursion are mainly of two types depending on the whether and function calls itself from within itself or from the other function call one. So, another majorly. The first one is called direct recursion and the another one is called indirect recursion. So, thus the two types of recursion are. So first direct recursion. So these can further categorized into four types. So tail recursion, head recursion, tree recursion and nested recursion. So first we'll learn about tail recursion. So if a recursion function calling itself and that recursive call is the last statement in the function, then it's known as tail recursion. After that call, the recursive function performs nothing. So the function has to process or perform any operation at the time of calling and it does not return at returning time. So this is the example. Void function in brackets int in n. So bracket close, parenthesis open. If n is greater than 0, then printf percentile d. So the last statement in the function. So this is the driver code. So int main parenthesis open, declaring the variable and function of x, and the output is 321. So let's understand the example by tracing tree of recursion function. This is how the function calls made. So let's understand the example by tracing tree of recursive function. So this is how the calls are made and how the outputs are produced. So from function 3 to 1, it's tail recursion. It reduces down. So, output are 3 to 1. So digits in red shown that the order is in which the calls are made, and according to the order of calling, the output are printed on the screen. Note that for function of 0, it gives nothing as output. Next, the second type of recursion is head recursion. If a recursive function calling itself and that recursive call is the first statement in the function, then it's known as head recursion. There's no statement, no operation before the call. So the function does not have any process or perform any operation at the time of calling, and all the operations are done at returning time. So this is the example of the head recursive function. So void function bracket int n, if n is greater than 0, so function of n minus 1, first statement in t, so count of uh, left shift. So this is the driver code and the output will be 1 2 3. So let's understand the example by tracing tree of recursive function. This is how the calls are made and how the outputs are produced. So in this the recursive function is increasing, means this is the head recursive function. So from function of 0 to function of 1 to function of 2 and function of 3. So output is 1 2 3. So digits in the red shown in that order is which the calls are made, and note that printing done at returning time and it does not call at calling time. So the third type of recursive function is tree recursion. So to understand tree recursion, let's first understand linear recursion. So if a recursive function calling itself for one time, then it's known as linear recursion. Otherwise, if a recursive function calling itself for more than one time, then it's known as tree recursion. So this is the example of tree recursion. So recursive function, void function of int main. If n is greater than 0, then printf percentile d. A function of n minus 1, function of calling twice. So once it. So driver function int main function of 3 return 0. Output will be 3211 211. So let's understand the example by tracing tree of recursive function. This is how the calls are made and how the outputs are produced. So from the function 3, two function 2's are there, and from both function 2's, two function 1's are there. So digits in the red showing that the order in which the calls are made, and according to the order of calling, the outputs are printed on the screen. Note the per point. And the last fourth type of recursion is, in this recursion, a recursive function will pass the parameters as a recursive call. That means recursion inside recursion. So let's see the example to understand this recursion. So in function, if n is greater than 100, return n is minus n is 10. So this is the driver code. Output will be 91, 9, 1. So let's understand the example by tracing tree of recursive function. This is how the calls are made and how the outputs are produced. So tracing tree of recursive function. 95 plus 11, 9. These are the functions. And the second type of recursion is inherited recursion. So in this recursion, there may be more than one functions and they are calling one another in a circular manner. So here is the diagram. Function A is calling function B is calling function C, and function C is calling function A. So from the above diagram, function A is calling for function B is calling for function C, and function C is calling for function A, and thus it makes a cycle. So this is the example. So void function of B int n, void function of A int n. If n is greater than 0, printf percentile d n. Function B is b of n minus 1. Void b int n. So if n is greater than 1, so printf percentile d and comma n. So function of n by 2 is, so this is the driver code, and the output will be 20199843 So let's understand the function by example by tracing tree of recursive function. That is how the calls are made and how the outputs are produced. So that's all in this presentation. Hope this presentation was informative, and thank you. Or else let's recap what we studied in this presentation. So what is recursion? The process in which a function calls itself directly or indirectly is called as recursion, and the corresponding function is called as recursive function. So there are two types of recursions. So first one is direct recursion and second one is indirect recursion. So among the first one, direct recursion, so direct recursion is categorized into four more parts: tail recursion, head recursion, tree recursion, and nested recursion. And the last one is second type of recursion is indirect recursion. In this recursion, there may be more than two functions and they call one another in a circular manner. So in this function A is calling function B is calling function C, and function C is calling function again A. So this is the indirect recursion. So thank you, hope this presentation was informative.